Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio for today's Horror-Thon episode, and sadly, the last one for 2020. I decided to really go out with a bang here, and I wanted to take a look at the John Carpenter Classic Big Trouble in Little China. Now, this movie has been pegged as an action movie for years and years, and I feel that really comes down to the fact that Kurt Russell was in this movie. Now, he did a lot of action movies in the 1980s, for those who don't know. Most of you listening probably know, but there's always those one or two that are like, what's the big deal about Kurt Russell? Isn't he the guy from the movie Miracle? Well, to get back to it, I do feel that this movie is more of a horror movie than an action movie at times, and we're going to explore that in this episode. Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, MetrObeliskRadio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute, Library, or whatever platform you're currently watching this on or listening to it on. Now, with that out of the way, let's get right into Big Trouble in Little China. Now, as always, with all movie retrospectives, we always start off with the creative team. Now, this movie was directed by John Carpenter himself, and I feel this is a man that really needs no introduction if you're a fan of horror or science fiction. Now, for those of you who aren't, most obviously remember him as the creator of Michael Myers and the Halloween franchise. Yes, it started with him. And he's done other movies like Assault on Precinct 13, The Thing, the remake from 1982, They Live with Roddy Piper and Keith David, In the Mouth of Madness that starred Sam Neill, Escape from New York and Escape from LA that both starred Kurt Russell as Snake Plissken. Now, this man has cemented himself in the world of not just horror and science fiction, but that really of pop culture. Now let's move on and into the writers, and there's two writers for this movie. You've got Gary Goldman, and now he only has 7 writing credits to his name that include this movie. His other writing credits are the tie-in video game of the same name to this movie, Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Navy SEALs with Charlie Sheen, Next with Nicolas Cage and Jessica Biel, that movie that followed, Magicians, and he is credited for the 2012 reboot of Total Recall, along with the announced reboot of this beloved movie that we are looking at today. And the next writer we're going to look at is David Z. Weinstein. Now, this would be the only movie that he would write. His other writing credits include the tie-in video game and the announced reboot of this beloved movie. Now, the two writers I just mentioned were first-time screenwriters at the time, but the movie was not written as a horror action movie. It was actually written as a Western that took place in the 1880s. 20th Century Fox hired another writer to come in and adapt the original screenplay into what we now know as Big Trouble in Little China, and that writer that they hired was W.D. Richter. Now, his writing credits include Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the remake that starred Donald Sutherland and Jeff Goldblum, Dracula with Frank Langella, Needful Things with Max von Sydow and Ed Harris, Home for the Holidays with Holly Hunter and a very, very young Robert Downey Jr., and the movie Stealth with Jessica Biel and Josh Lucas. Now let's move on to our character analysis portion of this, and we're going to start off with Kurt Russell as Jack Burden. Now, he's our main character for this movie. He's a truck driver that just happens to stumble into this ancient Chinese war and gets captured. After this, the man simply just wants his truck back. And that's it. Then we have Kim Cattrall as Gracie Law, and yes, that is how she's introduced in this movie. Oh, don't worry guys, it's just me, Gracie Law. Now, she's the lawyer, and at one point she gets captured because she has green eyes, and Lo Pan needs a woman with green eyes to break the curse. Then we have Dennis Dunn as Wang. He's the restaurant owner who is Jack's friend. He has a girl coming from China, and the girl gets kidnapped by Lo Pan's men. Then we have Victor Wong as Egg Shen. He's the guy that drives the tour bus, and he also deals in the Chinese magic. So he's needed primarily for that reason to confront Lo Pan, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And also, he's also the narrator for the story. Then we have Kate Burton as Margot. Now, she's the journalist who's accompanying Gracie, and there's really nothing more to her other than she's just along for the ride. And finally, we have James Hong as Lo Pan. Now, I would argue that he's actually the protagonist of this movie because his actions are actually moving the plot forward. Jack Burton's just getting in the way. Jack Burton just happens to stumble across everything. He's a guy who was cursed by the first Chinese emperor to live as a demon, unless if he can marry a girl with with green eyes, not 3 eyes, that would be weird, green eyes, and then sacrifice her so that he would become flesh again, and basically he becomes human once more. Now this movie starts out as normal as you can start out. A truck driver rolls into town and just has a fun night. After that, he's owed money from his friend. He and his friend go to the airport to pick up a girl that's coming in. She gets kidnapped. They chase the kidnappers and stumble upon an ancient war in Chinatown. At one point, the truck driver loses his truck, and that's all he wants to get back is just his truck. Now, if we look at the Jack Burton character, the truck driver, he is a man with no name character. He's the guy who strolls into town, solves the problem, and leaves. No backstory other than he's the stranger who just rolled into town one day. Now, I put this episode under Horror-Thon and for a simple reason. I feel that this movie is more of a horror movie with action elements rather than an action movie with horror elements. Jack Burton is not an action hero by any stretch of the imagination. He's just a truck driver. Yes, he carries a knife, but he's never fired a gun before. Now, how do I know this? Because at one point in the movie, when he tries to fire the machine pistol, he doesn't realize that the safety is on, and even when he disengages the safety, he accidentally fires off a few shots before he hits the first guy. Now, that doesn't sound like an action hero, and John Carpenter went out of his way to show that Jack Burton is not, this gun-wielding action hero just in that one moment. And that really goes for every other character in this movie. You have a truck driver, a lawyer, a journalist, a restaurant owner, and an old magic man going and fighting a supernatural threat. Yes, these people are literally fighting demons in the movie. There are creatures in the sewers below Chinatown. At one point, Gracie gets captured by a demon-like creature after going through a door that magically opened when she walked right on by. Ooh, I wonder what's in there. Yoink! Also, the first big scare in the movie comes after the elevator that Jack and Wang are in gets flooded, and they have to swim by all the dead bodies that are chained to the bottom of that water. Now, there's other moments that are clearly meant to be more horror. At one point, Wang says that the area is clear just to have the guy randomly jump out of nowhere and just start fighting with him. Now, I'll end the section off with this because I don't want to bore you to death. I said that this movie starts out normal. Just a truck driver who strolls into town, but then gets caught up in a kidnapping of a girl that leads to some ancient Chinese war with a guy that wants to break a curse by marrying a woman with green eyes just to kill her, so he returns to normal human, no longer demon, just because the truck driver wanted to make sure that the guy who owed him the money didn't skip town by going to the airport. None of the characters in this movie are action heroes, as I stated. The only one who could take on Lo Pan was Egg Shen, and even then, he couldn't fight Lo Pan on his own. His magic wasn't strong enough to beat Lo Pan, and it is shown by the end of the movie. Now, Lo Pan dies by Jack catching his knife and immediately throwing it back and hitting Lo Pan right square in the third eye. So now let's look at how this movie has been received overall. This movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 77% based on 44 critic reviews and an audience score of 82% based on 136,431 audience reviews. Now, this movie has a Metacritic score of 53 based on 14 critic reviews and a user score of 8.1 out of 10 based on 44 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at 7.3 out of 10, and that's based on 120,654 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $25 million back in 1986, so if we adjust that for inflation in 2020 numbers, that's a budget of $59,101,505.47. Yes, this is on the higher end of a mid-budget movie that's being made today. And the movie only grossed $11,100,374 during its initial theatrical run. Yes, at the time, this movie not only did poorly commercially, but critically as well. Roger Ebert said about the movie, quote, "Special effects don't mean much unless we care about the characters who are surrounded by them." David Anson of Newsweek wrote, quote, "Though it is action-packed, spectacularly edited, and often quite funny, one can't help feeling that Carpenter is squeezing the last drops out of a fatigued genre." And David Robinson wrote for the British newspaper The Times that he felt that John Carpenter was, quote, "overwhelmed by his own special effects without a strong enough script to guide him." Now, this movie doing so poorly critically and commercially at the time made John Carpenter swear off the Hollywood studio system entirely. After this, he would only do independent films, and John Carpenter said in an interview, quote, "The experience of Big Trouble was the reason I stopped making movies for the Hollywood studios. I won't work for them again. I think Big Trouble is a wonderful film, and I am very proud of it. But the reception it received and the reasons for that reception were too much for me to deal with. I'm too old for that sort of bullshit." Even though this movie was not beloved at the time, it has gone on to be a cult classic. An underrated gem, if you will. This movie even made AFI's top 500 films list at one point, somewhere in the 400s. I don't remember where exactly it was on that list. A lot of beloved classics from the 80s got this same treatment. The most famous examples of this are Blade Runner and Flash Gordon, the movie with Sam Jones. And I'll end the episode off with this. I enjoy the movie for what it is. It's just a fun action horror movie that you can pop on if you're not in the mood to watch something else a little more serious. But here's where my criticisms come out. I feel that there are spots in this movie where it wants to be an action movie and then immediately after it wants to be a horror movie. I feel that this movie does have a bit of an identity crisis as compared to John Carpenter's other movies like Halloween, The Thing, and They Live. I'm not saying that this movie is automatically bad for having an identity crisis. There are some good things that happen in this movie, and I'll even go as far as to say this. It's next to impossible to be bored watching this movie. But if I personally have the choice between watching this movie again or watching They Live again, I would pick They Live before I would pick Big Trouble in Little China. Now that mostly comes down to personal preference for me, because I actually didn't watch Big Trouble in Little China for the first time until I was 20. And that was just a few years ago. By the time I watched Big Trouble in Little China, I had already seen the movies They Live, The Thing, In the Mouth of Madness, and Escape from New York. Also Escape from LA. If Big Trouble in Little China had been my first or second John Carpenter movie that I had ever seen, then I would probably have more nostalgia for it. But again, this is not a bad movie. It's a fun movie that is that you will not get bored watching.